Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode there's a seemingly unsolvable mystery, which means the only man for the job is Benoit Blanc in the Knives Out mystery Wake Up, Dead Man. Boxer-turned-priest Judd Duplessis, played by Josh O'Connor, has been assigned to Chimney Rock in upstate New York, to the Church of Monsignor Jefferson Wicks, played by Josh Brolin, who is notorious for his abrasive style that has willed his congregation down to those most loyal to him. On Good Friday, Wicks is somehow murdered during the service despite being alone in a locked room, and the only person who can solve it has just arrived, the legendary Benoit Blanc, played by Daniel Craig. Knives Out may not have been the first to revive the murder mystery genre. Kenneth Branagh's Murder on the Orient Express can lay some claim to that, but the franchise has certainly led the way. We've had a deluge of cozy murder mysteries in the last few years, from books like The Thursday Murder Club, itself adapted into a film earlier this year, to TV shows like Only Murders in the Building and Rian Johnson's own Poker Face. And the first Knives Out is genuinely brilliant and fun, packed with a star-studded cast, all competing to steal scenes, brilliantly biting dialogue, and the satire of American conservatism coming together to create something very watchable even after you knew who did it. But the most memorable part of it was Daniel Craig and his foghorn leghorn southern drawl as the master detective Benoit Blanc, whose reputation very much precedes him. Craig is perfectly cast and is clearly having so much fun getting to show off his funny side, and excellently timed for launching a new franchise just as he was getting off the James Bond train and not letting that role define him. Annoyingly, despite being a sleeper hit in cinemas, Netflix bought the rights for the two sequels, thereby robbing multiplexes of some obvious hits, and the first sequel, Glass Onion, I still enjoyed, but it was definitely much broader in terms of tone and comedy. I found Glass Onion to be absolutely hilarious, and its very unsubtle commentary on idiotic and self-absorbed billionaires has only gotten more accurate in the years since, let's put it that way. It's also one of the very few films actively set during COVID that actually worked, and these Knives Out films are very much shaped by the moment of their release. Like the previous two films, Wake Up Dead Man has its own particular tone, while still keeping the overall feel of the series. In some ways, I would say that it sits somewhere between the satire of the first film, while having some of the scale and comic exaggeration of Glass Onion, but has an noticeably darker tone than either of them. But is it the best Knives Out entry? I don't think it is. In fact, I would argue that this might actually be the weakest of the three so far. Now, don't get me wrong, I enjoyed Wake Up Dead Man a lot. I had plenty of fun with it. It's more the previous two outings set such a high bar, but there are issues here that I couldn't ignore. But even a slightly lesser Knives Out film is still very enjoyable. One of the ways this feels like a return to the spirit of the first film is the focus has shifted away from Benoit Blanc again. Although Craig was the top bill star in Knives Out, he wasn't the main protagonist there, instead focusing on Ana de Armas's Marta, who was trying to stay one step ahead of him because she feared she was the guilty party. Craig became very much the centre of attention in Glass Onion, in part because of the character's popularity, and we saw much of the film from his perspective. It's a move that could potentially overexpose the character, especially as Craig deliberately hammed it up, but him and Johnson got away with it there. But I think that Johnson knew that he couldn't do that again, so he does something rather bold instead. He removes Blanc from the first act of the film. We see him right at the very start for just one shot, just so we know what film we're watching, but otherwise, the film begins with a lengthy Daniel Craig-less flashback. If we're at risk at having a bit too much of him, then keeping Blanc off screen builds an absence that makes the heart grow fonder. When Blanc does finally show up at around the 40-minute mark, it feels like an event, especially the way he just strolls into the action because an inexplicable murder demands his immediate attention. Like the series itself, Blanc is sporting a new look, this time with much longer hair that further sets Craig apart from his Bond persona, and if you're expecting an explanation for that, don't. But what this does is firmly put Blanc back into part of the ensemble rather than being the focal point, who was parts of the narrative and links the films together, but isn't necessarily driving it. Now, make no mistake, Craig does get a lot of screen time here, and he's having as much fun as usual, especially in a humorously gross out moment in an autopsy, but he's used for just the right amount. But there are parts where he dips out of the movie because, at the end of the day, it isn't really Blanc's story. Instead, the protagonist here is Josh O'Connor's Judd, and it's another example of his understated malleability as an actor. Judd used to be a boxer until he killed a man in the ring, and his shame over that and his need to atone for that sin has led him towards the priesthood. Judd's got an optimistic view on faith, but he's also got a pretty short fuse with that right hook, hence why he's reassigned by Father Langston, played by Craig's Bond co-star Jeffrey Wright, who manages to steal his handful of scenes that bookend the movie. Judd memorably describes himself as young, dumb, and full of Christ, so he's well suited to having to face the Monsignor, who clearly doesn't want him there and is determined to get rid of him, or at least turn everyone against him. But that clash of personalities means that when Wicks turns up dead, everyone thinks that Judd is the prime suspect, as he's the one that bears the most obvious grudge. And also, let's face it, he's killed before, and that certainly doesn't help Judd's already guilty conscience and puts us back in a similar vein to Marta previously, who also wrestled with her complicity despite being fundamentally honest. But if she was trying to hide her involvement, then Judd is trying to prove that he really wasn't the killer, but the evidence is so stacked against him that even he starts to doubt his own innocence, which serves as a metaphor for how he struggles with his faith. O'Connor is a brilliantly versatile actor, and a very likeable one, and he's well suited for being a Hitchcockian wrong man straight out of a film noir. I'd imagine that Hitch's 1956 film is a direct influence. Johnson gives him an excellent showcase here, and he's compelling, so much so that you really don't feel the absence of Craig in the earlier sections, and you're rooting for Judd. Even more so than Ana de Armas or Janelle Monáe previously, Wake Up Dead Man absolutely belongs to O'Connor ultimately. I do think it's interesting the way that Johnson structures these entries, particularly the way they use flashbacks. The first Knives Out had a key flashback early on and then peppered them throughout, whereas Glass Onion kept its biggest flashback in the second half with a perspective shift. Because the first half or so of the movie plays out in flashback, this is the most a film in the trilogy has played out in linear order, playing out in the lead up to and over the Easter holiday, although we do get flashbacks within the flashback, and several scenes do get replayed several times, but the structure, in a way, also reminded me a little bit of Johnson's own Poker Face, where many episodes have the recurring sleuth pop up midway through the story, and that does seem like it might be the trajectory these films will have if they continue. However, that flashback does lead me to one of my issues with the film, in that, as a mystery, I felt this was perhaps the weakest. Knives Out suffered from being a little bit too obvious who the real villain was, and this doesn't have that, but Johnson spends a lot of time early on setting up all the pieces in the story. He puts the clues in plain sight, and maybe I'm a little bit too experienced with these stories, but I found it to be slightly too telegraphed. There's certain details, and I'll be extremely careful here and not even hint at what they are, that as soon as they were introduced, I thought, I know where this is heading, and it turned out I was right, and it made the viewing experience a bit odd for me, because I felt like I was ahead of the movie somewhat. I might not have figured all of it out, and I defy anyone to do that, but part of the joy of the Knives Out films is being surprised and outwitted by Johnson, at least on the first viewing, and I didn't get as much of that here. I don't think it helps there isn't the only mystery at play here, as he stacks several of them on top of each other, including a prominent subplot involving a missing family inheritance that Wicks's late mother Grace, played by Annie Hamilton in flashbacks, was searching for. Grace is often referred to as Harlot, and often much stronger than that, by much of the congregation, which serves as something of a commentary on misogyny in the church and the film's larger themes of forgiveness. But in that middle act of the film, because there's so much plot going on, I do think the movie starts to lose some of the momentum of its strong start, and the blow to being the longest entry to date can be felt. The film does recover in time for the last act, but even then, there are a lot of involved and convoluted explanations to tie up the loose ends that it can be a little bit hard to actually keep up with it all. But maybe the reason why it isn't as tight as a mystery is that Johnson is arguably more interested in religion. In some ways, it goes back to the themes of the first Knives Out, given that conservatism in the church, or at least a certain kind of prosperity gospel at least, go hand in America, so there is a bit of overlap. Josh Brolin's Wicks is all fire and brimstone, a Monsignor who probably thinks the Old Testament was too mild, less about goodness and kindness towards others as casting judgment upon anyone. He leads not by hope, but by fear, isolation, and self-righteousness, and in so doing creates a cult of personality. You're either with him or you're against him. It's hard not to think of a few other figures if you catch my drift. Brolin may make an early exit. That said, he probably has more screen time here than he did in The Running Man, but he's perfectly cast as a forceful, intimidating figure and getting a few amusing moments of his own by forcing Judd to sit through lengthy confessions for his own gratification, if you know what I mean. Again, another reason why I feel like this is a weaker outing is that I don't think it makes as strong a use out of the ensemble cast as some of the previous films did, especially Glass Onion, where everyone got a moment to shine. Mila Kunis in particular is given very little, largely expositional role as the local police chief Geraldine, who's also pretty certain that Judd did it. But Wicks also has a bunch of followers who all become potential suspects with possible motives for seeing him dead. The indomitable Glenn Close plays Wicks's right-hand Martha, who has a very funny running gag of sneaking up on people and has a bit of a thing for Thomas Hayden Church's groundskeeper Samson. There's Kerry Washington's lawyer Vera and her adoptive son Cy, played by Daryl McCormack, a failed Republican politician who hopes to use Judd to make a career comeback on social media, and he's often hiding in the background of scenes with a phone camera rig recording people's conversations, whether they want him to or not. Andrew Scott is sci-fi writer Lee Ross, who has become a complete devotee of Wicks and hopes to turn his Substack into a book to restore his flatlining career. Presumably after Fleabag, Scott heard that this had a hot priest in it and asked if there was a role for him. Jeremy Renner, in his first film role after his near-fatal accident, plays the local doctor Nat Sharp, who has turned to drink and faith after his wife left him, and it's pretty funny that Renner actually pops up in this, as his fictional hot sauce was one of the most memorable gags of Glass Onion. And Kaylee Spaney plays Simone, a famous concert cellist whose career has been halted by a disability that mostly confines her to a wheelchair, who is looking for some faith, or maybe a miracle, to try and help her condition. And that last one is likely a hint at where the movie's sympathies truly lie. Don't be confused, this isn't an attack on religion. Far from it. Benoit Blanc may be a loud and proud atheist, he believes in facts and evidence, but the movie doesn't necessarily share that conviction. What the film argues is the belief in something, religious or not, is vital and important, that it can help us in our darkest moments of need, even if most of us won't have a sudden come to Damascus moment of conversion and realization like some of the characters do. But those beliefs, our ideas and values, shape who we are and our communities. And what's surprising is how serious and introspective Wake Up Dead Man is when it comes to its subject, which is apparently quite personal to Johnson. There's one where Judd calls up someone for a clue, and then the person he asks suddenly asks for help of their own because they need some advice on their own personal difficulties. And Judd takes the time to listen, even with everything hanging over him. It's a scene that goes from advancing the plot to an unexpected character moment, and I think it's one of the most important bits of the film that demonstrates its heart, but also what the function of religion should be. It has a compassionate view about it, and while you can believe whatever you want, it makes a case for it. What it is critical of is those that exploit religion and twist it for their own ends, and to spread prejudice and division like Wicks does, the kind that Judd describes as a cancer to be cut out. You can even see this in the church where the film is set, which is effectively desecrated and damaged, and crucially missing its cross, an obvious allegory for the way that Wicks's ideas have corrupted the values it should represent. Judd describes it as being like a neo-Gothic Disneyland, and in a way, that kind of describes the movie in that it plays with those gothic trappings. It is still a ride. There are some plot turns that I was a bit less on board with. When I realised where the film was going, I thought, that's a little bit too much for me, that's a little bit too exaggerated, but I do agree with what the film is saying overall, which is that we need much less intolerance, fighting and judgment, and far more understanding and especially forgiveness. As I said previously, Wake Up Dead Man isn't my favourite Knives Out movie, but that doesn't mean it isn't good. Johnson has created something which is ambitious and complex, and feels as timely and relevant as the series usually is, if a little bit more uneven and messy. I don't think it works as much as a whodunit this time out, but I think the exploration of religion is unexpectedly nuanced. Sometimes it gets a bit mired in its own plotting at the expense of its themes and characters, but trust me when I say it, this is still entertaining and hilariously funny, with some great quotable lines. If you didn't click with Glass Onion, and I know that some people didn't, this might convert you again. And I have faith that Johnson and Cray will be back for more of this in the future. I hope, at least. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or my YouTube Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can help me crack the case over at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and hype the video, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.